Let's head to the West Coast now, where British Columbians are still waiting for the results of Saturday's provincial election.
This has been a historic night. This has been a night where we have seen the political landscape in British Columbia change forever.
Now, we don't know what the final count's going to be in the province, but what we do know is that there was a clear majority for the progressive values.
John Rustad's Conservatives and David Eby's NDP are in a dead heat, with the NDP sitting at 46 seats, the Conservatives at 45, and the Greens at 2. Dan Burritt is the host of CBC Vancouver News at 6, and he joins me now. Hey, Dan.
Hey, GP, how you doing?
Good. Dan, this is so incredibly close. What's the state of the count?
Tense if you're a candidate. If you're Elections BC officials, you've been busy and they still have more work to do. Right now, Elections BC tells us there are about 49,000 votes left to count. They've already done the initial count, but there are 2 automatic recounts that will happen in 2 ridings where there is a difference of 100 votes or less. All of that counting will be done between October 26th and 28th. Still almost a week away, and those ballots and recounts could decide who forms government in BC. Right now, those narrow margins make it impossible for CBC News to project winners in 11 ridings. Wow. The NDP at the moment are leading in 6 of those ridings, so still very much in play as to who's going to form government right now. But as you mentioned, NDP at 46, Conservatives at 45, and the Greens, who could become very popular, at 2.
Yeah, it could be a lot of power for them. What are you hearing from some of the new MLAs elect today?
Well, we've been talking with or reaching out to Conservatives, New Democrats, as well as Greens. Some are anxiously waiting on those results because it's not clear. Others are waiting to transition to new life as an MLA. We know NDP leader David Eby, who handily won his seat. He is still the premier. He's been calling candidates and supporters. And notably, we've learned he's reached out to Green MLA-elect Jeremy Valerio. He won in the riding of West Vancouver, Sea to Sky. He narrowly lost in 2020. He's one of those 2 Green MLAs-elect who could prove very popular in the legislature. Their leader, Sonia Furstenau, did not win her race in Vancouver Island. We spoke with Jeremy Valerio earlier. He says before he starts thinking about what other parties the Greens could possibly work with, whether it's New Democrats or Conservatives, he hopes that everyone who is eventually declared a winner and is elected can work together. He notes the Greens ran in only 69 of 93 ridings, but he wonders whether or not it's their role to form government at all. Have a listen.
I think maybe the growth mindset that we have to grow until we're suddenly government, maybe that's not the Greens' role. Maybe our role is to elect 12, 20, MLAs every time and be the conscience of the legislature, bring things forward and bring up the issues instead of, having to grow and suddenly become government.
So both Valerian and his fellow Green MLA-elect could be very popular once the dust settles and we get some final numbers, JP.
All right, thank you. The CBC's Dan Burritt in Vancouver for us tonight. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
People are desperate for change in this province. When 1 in 2 youth is thinking about leaving British Columbia, when 1 in 3 people are thinking about leaving this province, clearly something is not right in the province of British Columbia. And so I think that's what we've tapped into in terms of this, that people want that change. They want common sense brought back and just get back to the basics. And I think that is ultimately what drove so many people to want to support the Conservative Party of British Columbia.
Well, in Ottawa, the federal NDP leader says the next general election could look quite similar to BC's race.
There's going to be a lot of lessons we're going to evaluate and learn from the campaign, but I think generally what we're seeing is there's a fight for the future of our country, and that fight is coming down to the vision of Conservatives and the vision of New Democrats.
The Power Panel is here to dig into this nail-biter election, its potential federal implications. Lisa Raitt is a former Conservative cabinet minister. Brad Levine is former national campaign director for the NDP. And here with me, Vandana Cutter is a former advisor to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And Rob Russo is the former CBC Parliamentary Bureau Chief, now Canada correspondent for The Economist. Hey, guys.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Thanks for joining me on this Monday. So, Brad, I'll start with you. You know BC politics pretty well. Looks like we're in for, whatever the result might be, a pretty narrow victory for whoever pulls it off. Right now, the NDP are sitting pretty with a 1-seat lead over the Conservatives. But the question is, did David Eby fall flat here? I mean, voters denied him a majority. He had a pretty good sizable lead out of the last election, right? He had pretty good caucus size. Now it's not looking so great. Now he's just going to have to cling to power, maybe by lining up with the Greens. Was this a bad result for Eby?
Well, I think it's closer to 2017 than it is to 2020 when Premier John Horgan won that sizable majority that you're describing. But I think this is going back to a traditional, very close British Columbia election outcome. I think 2020 kind of skewed our perceptions a little bit because of the size of the NDP's majority there. You've got over 900,000 votes for the NDP, about 100,000 more than the Conservatives. So, it's certainly, I think, more closer to the traditional one. And I think Mr. Eby said it well on election night when he talked about how he's heard the message from the voters. That is, if he does have the ability to form a government going forward, that he's going to govern a little bit differently. And I think he's going to take these results to heart and maybe focus on what he heard on the doorsteps and throughout the election campaign. So close, but I think we're going back to traditional neck and neck, and I think it does foretell what I think we can expect in the upcoming federal election.
Lisa, John Rustad pulled off really what is an impressive electoral feat either way, however it goes. He takes a party from essentially absolute obscurity. It's been out of power for well over 100 years, and they have a lot of controversy along the campaign trail, a lot of candidates saying some off-color things, maybe some missteps, maybe some controversial positions by the leader himself. I'm thinking maybe his take on climate change, for example, and yet he still comes within spitting distance of forming a majority or forming a government, taking down an NDP government that has a strong majority heading into this campaign. What does that tell you about how BC voters are feeling right now and how they're feeling about Conservative politicians more generally?
I think, first of all, you can definitely say that BC voters were looking for change because that's definitely reflected. I take from the response of the leader of the Conservatives in BC that he's pretty happy about this. And as a result, I mean, you can see him on screen there. He's smiling. He said things are different now. So even though that it's just a whisper away from actually forming a government, he's pretty pleased with how things have rolled out, which means internally they probably beat their own expectations. And that's probably good for them. We'll see what comes next. Jay, I would just say one thing is that the problem with respect to having these kinds of close races is that sometimes you get caught up in the politics of it, when at the same time, you really got to start thinking about the economics of running a province. So I hope that they don't spend a lot of time on the politics around setting up governments or coming up to decisions on who's going to be the government, and that they're able to actually pivot and bring British Columbia to where they need to be, which is to be an economic powerhouse in the country. It's really important that they get it right.
Rob, is this what you were expecting? Were you expecting a nail biter?
Yeah, I think so. I think your question, Lisa, is a very good one. This is a party that didn't exist. They don't exactly have a boom leader. He's charismatically challenged, I think it's fair to say.
Right.
He needed to draw upon support from across the country, and Conservatives did go there and do it. So it's a rather remarkable result for the Conservatives. What should federal politicians take away from this? Well, number one, people are angry. There's anger out there, and there's some fear and loathing out there. He had a certain wackaloon quotient himself, and there were wackaloons in his party. It didn't matter, it seemed. So we can see that climate change wasn't an issue there at all. What was an issue? Affordability, housing, Medicare was an issue out there. There are still millions of people in British Columbia who don't have ready access to health care. They're having to go to Seattle and other places nearby in order to get that health care. That was an issue there as well. So those are the issues that people seem to be concerned about and voting on. And some of those other issues, charisma, not important. Climate, less important, it seemed. And whether or not people are happy or angry, they're angry right now. I think that's one of the biggest conclusions you can take from the BC election.
Yeah, in the country's supposedly greenest province, they have just given this guy a potential to form government, even though he is a climate change skeptic, right? I mean, it's quite, he's done it on the strength of his support in rural parts of the province, but it's still quite a notable result, right, for a province that first launched a carbon tax, for example. Vandana, as you sit here as a federal Liberal, obviously the Liberals were not on the ballot this time, or the BC United, whatever they were going by latest name. But still, you have to wonder, Now we're looking at every province west of Ontario. There really isn't much of a Liberal movement at all, at least provincially, right? I mean, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, BC, Alberta, there really isn't a Liberal Party in the running in any of these places. It really is narrowing into a two-party race in Western Canada, at least. Does that leave you with some concerns? Do you believe Jagmeet Singh when he says this is how it's going to be for the next federal election, a fight between Conservatives and the NDP?
No, not at all, actually. I think what I've seen is that there are still progressive parties out west. And maybe it's not branded as Liberal, but I know lots of Liberals who are helping, the BC NDP. So I think that what it tells me, and I saw this with Manitoba, you see this in Saskatchewan, you see a lot of close races, not only in BC, but we're going to see one tonight in New Brunswick. We see a close race down south. So I think there is still a space for progressive policies where Liberals can still pull from. And they've worked traditionally very well with the NDP. What I find most interesting, there's so many close races across the country, that tells me more about the voter volatility and the volatility of the electorate. And that politicians are still having a hard time how to connect with voters in this day and age, with AI, with misinformation, with disinformation, with campaigns being online as well, that people are really skeptical and they don't know really where to go. So I think as politicians try to figure out how to connect with the electorate, you'll see more of these close races more and more.
Yeah, Brad, speaking of connecting with the electorate, the NDP did pretty well in urban ridings right in the province, but kind of struggled a little bit in some of the suburban ridings. I'm thinking of Surrey in particular, an ethnically mixed part of the Lower Mainland there that has traditionally been friendly to more progressive parties. The Conservatives did well there in Surrey with their message to axe the tax, stop the crime, fix the budget. We're hearing echoes of what Pierre Poilievre and the federal Conservatives have been saying on this level. Does that concern you, thinking about the next federal election, that some of these ethnically diverse parts of the country, some of the suburban areas where Liberals, NDP maybe have had strength in the past, that they are now turning to Conservatives instead?
Yeah, there's no question. Both Surrey and Richmond, you could probably just drill right down into those two clusters of ridings to pick out why Mr. Rustad did as well as he did. And some of those NDP incumbents in Surrey, long-standing MLAs and some former MPs, like I'm thinking of Ginny Sims, for example, and in Richmond as well. It was crime, and how you deal with drugs, and also the issue of immigration. I think was discussed in the provincial election. Will definitely be discussed there as well. For New Democrats, I think we and Mr. Eby in particular, and for Singh, we're going to have to make sure that there's a clear, coherent game plan when it comes to safety in our neighborhoods. When you're on the street, there's mental health issues, there are drugs, the decriminalization, all of those issues were front and center in those two major cities. So for both Eby and for the Democrats federally, we're going to have a coherent game plan to offer solutions that we can't just always go back to it's all about health care, because people want to feel safe in their communities. And Mr. Rustad, to be fair, I mean, pretty simple. For Conservatives, I think that the issue of crime can be a very simple line for a lot of people. It's much more complicated, and I think Mr. Rustad makes crime out for, but certainly in those ethno-cultural communities, there needs to be answers to those things that may not be top-of-mind issues in other ridings.
Yeah, Lisa, is the electoral equation just different now? Like, has it shifted in this kind of post-COVID world? Because we were talking a lot about healthcare, the environment, some of the more progressive policy ideas, and now it seems like every election I talk about is dominated by some of these more conservative ideas about cracking down on crime. Even David Eby, when he was on the campaign trail, saying he was going to close down some of these open-air drug markets, take a tougher approach to crime and drugs, and asking the federal government to dismantle the decriminalization push, forced treatment plans in prisons for people who are a particular danger to public safety. It seems like it's just a whole new landscape out there, and it just happens to be benefiting Conservatives right now.
Well, I think people are voting with respect to what their reality is. And yeah, things are a lot different than they were in 2015. Take a look at Kelowna. Take a look at what's happening in encampments all through British Columbia. What I find interesting is that if I were to take a look at British Columbia as a microcosm of what may happen federally, and we take a look at personalities, I would submit that Mr. Eby is not as unliked as Mr. Trudeau is. And I would say that Mr. Poilievre is possibly more palatable than Mr. Rustad was, and some of the kinds of things that he said. I mean, Rob used some colorful language about what kind of a politician he is. I won't repeat it, but certainly I don't think this bears well at all for a Liberal government. And I think Mr. Singh is completely tied to Mr. Trudeau. And as a result, he's going to suffer in the same kind of way that Mr. Eby has. Mr. Eby was very close to Mr. Trudeau, and it came across, and that probably didn't help him in his election either. So if we're to boil it all up to where we are federally, I think that this is a good way for the Conservatives to determine how their game plan is moving forward. And it's going to be the same as it is right now, which is focus on things that are worrying average Canadians every day. And that is crime, it's about drugs, and it's about affordability, and continue to focus on that area and point out the fact that the Liberal and NDP coalition has done nothing to help you in the last number of years.
Liberals and NDP might disagree with that, Rob, on some issues, of course. The child care benefit, they've taken action on climate. The carbon tax is seemingly having some effect on bringing down carbon emissions. I mean, they do have a record. It might not be a record that everybody's super happy with, but they do have some things to point to as successes. But does it matter? Does it seem like Pierre Poilievre has just captured the zeitgeist, that he has been able to successfully make these issues politically expedient for him? You know, he's been able to capitalize on crime. He's been able to capitalize on drugs. He's been able to capitalize on some of the shakiness in the economy. Do you think that the writing is just on the wall and that the BC elections just kind of reaffirm that?
Boy, if I knew that, I'd go right to the store across the street and get a 649 ticket, and it would be a winning ticket. But look, I'm not sure it's a Conservative thing as much as it's an anti-incumbency thing. We're going to find out tonight in New Brunswick whether or not it's a Conservative or a Liberal thing. If the Liberal wins there, I think it will reinforce what I believe is true, which is it's been a miserable time to be an incumbent government the last few years. It's been a great time to be in opposition. And it doesn't matter whether you're in Germany or France or in the UK or in the US. It's very, very difficult to convince voters that the pain that they're feeling, that the economic malaise that they're feeling isn't real, and they want somebody to blame for it. So in that way, the result in BC is remarkable in the other way too. Like we have an incumbent government that's in a position to perhaps reform government. I bet you any money, though, Mr. Eby probably wishes he'd have gone immediately to the people once he was made leader, without a lot of the problems that came to the fore about drug use and inflation and housing. But I just think that tonight we'll find out in New Brunswick whether or not this is a Conservative wave that's happening or an anti-incumbency wave that's happening. And I believe it's an anti-incumbency change. And it's really, really hard to campaign when time for a change is on everybody's lips.
Vandana, final quick thoughts to you?
I agree with what Rob said. I think it's about incumbency. I think the problem with governments is that when you're repeating the same message over and over, people tune you out. So how do you still share things you've done, but still remain authentic to people and be new and innovative? And I think that's what they're grappling with. I still remember when we did the CERB, I remember thinking 2 years from now, no one's going to remember this. Voters want to know, what are you doing for me today? Right? And even if you have the CCB, and I think that has done one of our most successful policies, people just want to be like, why is this so expensive? And I think the government's going to have a task at hand to make sure they can address that.
Yeah, voters forget pretty quickly, don't they? Okay, let's